fine art lithography, traditionally for decades, if not hundreds of years, was a grease etching process using Bavarian limestone, thick, large slabs of Bavarian limestone. The artist would use a grease wash that looked very much like an ink wash, or a pencil, which is a grease pencil. They would do their images on the surface of a finely ground flat surface, Bavarian limestone, and then there would be a process by which the surface would be etched so that the areas where their artist had put the wash or drawing with a grease pencil would resist the etching of everything around it. Then when ink is applied on a wet stone, you would sponge during the printing process, you would dampen the entire stone, and the areas that were etched that had a grease base,
Right.
when a roller of ink was rolled across the stone, the ink would only stick to the grease etched areas which were washed or drawn by the artist. And that paper was laid on there and was rolled under a big press. When Gemini, these new technologies of printing, period, not fine art printing necessarily, but printing technologies were burgeoning and being born and invented. And so they were brought into Gemini and introduced to artists like aluminum plates, which would replace Bavarian limestone, much easier to do multicolored lithographs if you have a number of plates that you can use in conjunction with slabs of Bavarian limestone. Instead of using 10 slabs, you might use 2 slabs of Bavarian limestone and maybe 3 or 4 of the aluminum plates, so all of these technologies was what birthed Gemini. Master printer was brought in from Marlowe, France, Serge Lozingo. And so Ken Tyler, who founded Gemini, is the person who brought fine art printing to the United States. It didn't exist in the United States until Gemini was born in 1966. I worked there in the early 70s as the curator. And what Tyler would do is that he would go to New York and places where guys like Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Roy Lichtenstein, and the luminaries of the day had their studios, and he would just go up and grab them and say, hey, come out to California, sunny California, and do a project, do a suite of prints with me. I've got fine art printing in Los Angeles. So he would just go out and wrangle these guys, and they would come in, they would house them at the Chateau Marmont, which was a very exotic old hotel on Sunset Boulevard, wine and dine them, and they would come in and do editions. And that's how Gemini has existed since its beginning. And they published these editions of prints, and they're historically significant because of these reasons. So David Hockney, Richard Serra, anybody who had any significance in the contemporary art world were brought in. It wasn't open to the public. It was simply selected artists of the day by the owners, Ken Tyler, and they're eventually taken over by 2 other men, Stan Grinstein and Sid Felsen. And Gemini enjoyed a special spot in contemporary art for all of these reasons. So the editions that they did, not only did they employ traditional techniques, but they used various materials and technologies from Southern California, where the entire space industry was born, and the nucleus of the space industry being in Southern California made available all kinds of other materials So Gemini did traditional fine art printing, but a lot of experimentation. And Gemini has distinguished itself that way as being innovative as well as bringing in traditional printmaking to the United States. So I was a curator for 6 years in the early 70s and did a number of projects with Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Hockney, and Roy Lichtenstein, and the luminaries of the day. I was very fortunate because I was just out of graduate school, and for me, these people don't teach. Rauschenberg and Johns and people of that level, they don't. You won't find them in art schools. So for me, it was a big thrill as a young, hopeful contemporary artist to collaborate with these guys and get to know them personally and have relationships with these people that were were rock stars in the contemporary art world. So it was a very enriching time for me, and I enjoyed the technologies, and I enjoyed being around the artists who I later wound up rejecting as not necessarily as significant as I thought as a young uh, student, art student, and eventually saw things within the personalities of contemporary artists that helped me to move past contemporary art. And so my experience at Gemini was invaluable in my personal evolution away from the contemporary avant-garde and back to more traditional definitions of art. But it was still an exciting time. Enjoyed it very much.
But what are the projects specifically that you worked
Well, I mean, I'd have to look them up, but each one, Jasper Johns' crosshatch series, a number of his 0 through 9 prints. Rauschenberg did 2 or 3 projects while I was there. I'd have to look up and see what the editions were, what the suites were. That there were nothing unusual. Hoarfrost, there's one called the Hoarfrost series, where he printed on large pieces of silk that overlapped the paper that was a lithograph. They're called the Hoarfrost series, which is a very well-known series. And then some just traditional suites of prints on paper. Rauschenberg was probably the most innovative in that he was very interested in experimenting with new materials, like the Hoarfrost series, where the lithography was possible to be, with all of the master printers at Gemini. We were able to do things like print on silk, fine art lithography on silk, and marry them with traditional paper base, and we did handmade paper, for instance. One of the reasons I was brought over when I was getting my master's at California Institute of the Arts, I was experimenting with paper, and I happened to know one of the people that worked at Gemini, and they brought me over and interviewed me because they wanted to begin to do handmade paper projects. And so I got involved in that with an artist by the name of Keith Saunier. And so we did something that nobody had done in the United States, which is to make large pieces of handmade paper that integrated the color of the paper with the designs, and they were something like 3 meters wide. So a 3 meter by 2 meter size sheet of handmade paper. I was brought in for that project, and then I was interviewed when the curating position opened up, and they hired me as the head curator for that reason. So that's an example of the kind of experimentation that Gemini fosters. Gemini encouraged artists to do these kinds of experimental editions. They did things called multiples, where they were multiples of a sculpture but the sculptures were not traditional. Uh, for instance, they would be tin cans that, or large, gallon cans that had television monitors embedded in them. A guy by the name of Keenholz did projects like that, uh, and so there's a number of different kinds of materials and experimentations that were done, and too numerous for me to mention quickly. I'd have to really look up everything I worked on, but it was an exciting time.
So who did you work with more, Rauschenberg or Jasper Johns?
I worked with Johns. Johns and I became very close. We had a relationship. He invited me to be his what would I say, his assistant, and I would have to move to New York where his studio was. So Johns and I were quite close. We spent time together, go to dinner, and I got to know Jasper intimately.
And how did he use your knowledge, or how was the collaboration with him?
Oh, when he was doing projects, like he did a project where he took one of Jasper liked to take an image that he had painted,
Mm-hmm.
and redigest it, and continue to repeat it,
Mm-hmm.
and do various permutations. And so he was doing a series at the time called Crosshatch series. So he did a suite of prints where he divided up square. He broke the painting down into a series of squares, and so each edition would have only some of the squares that were part of the larger image. And he was kind of stuck, for instance, in that project about what to do with the areas that were vacant. And so, we would talk about what kind of line quality. Would it be a pencil? He didn't want it to be didactic. He didn't want it to look like a chart. And so, we talked about what kind of what would use, a pencil, a grease pencil, a pen, what kind of line quality would be best so that it didn't look didactic, which is what he was worried about. Paper, for instance, he loved newsprint, and so I told him, let me see if I can get some newsprint as acid. It'll disintegrate. You can't use newsprint as a permanent. And so I was collaborating with custom paper makers all over the world. And there was a man in Spain, I've forgotten his name, who I used to collaborate with to get large sheets, and I would talk to him and say, give me some sheets, a meter by 3/4 of a meter. Give me 500 sheets of that, and I'd like this quality of the paper, this color, this texture. And so I was able to suggest to Jasper, I said, why don't you let me see if I can get some beautiful rag paper that looks like newsprint, has the color and the texture of newsprint. So he liked that idea, so I collaborated with a handmade paper maker from Spain and was able to get a batch of beautiful cotton rag paper that looked exactly like newsprint. And so those are the kinds of things that Jasper and I did together.
And Rauschenberg, did you?
Rauschenberg was more he's a drunk. He would come in with an entourage of his people that he traveled with and who worked with him in a studio in Florida. And he lived on an island in Florida, to think of the island. And he would come in and kind of grand style, and he would show up in the morning and begin drinking. And so he would be, but he was, he could hold his liquor, but he was pretty much a severe alcoholic. And so he was just sort of grand. He wasn't really collaborating with anybody really. He was more of a showman.
But what was your
But
function?
I would present paper to him, suggest paper, which was something that I specialized in. So when he was working on a project, I'd go in and talk to him and ask him what he's doing and what kind of paper do you think might be best for this kind of a project instead of traditional white arches or so well you might want to try some of these other papers um, and how big the edition might be. Not a lot of uh, specific collaboration with Rauschenberg. And then when the editions were done, I would go through them, each one, which is part of my job, and I would look at every single print, and I would suggest to him that while out of pulling 100 prints, that maybe only 30 of them deserve to be in the edition because the others were simply not consistent. And so then I might cut 10 or 15 of the inconsistent pulls aside and say, you can sign these as artist proofs, but I don't think they should be part of the edition. And, I would just kind of give opinions about the validity of the edition based on how accurate the pulls were to the RTP. RTP is right to print or bon attire, the good try. So when the artist is collaborating with the printers and myself, when they come in, they're trying various inks. I did things like mix ink for Rauschenberg. I've always been very, very good, I suppose, with colors, similar to musicians having an ear. I've been able to duplicate color, and sometimes Rauschenberg was so loose because he was drinking so much that he would not write down the inks that he used to come up with color, a certain color. So at the end, the printers would be stuck and say, well, he didn't write down. So I was able to find the color by mixing inks and kind of pick up the slack for him. But he loved to party. He used to have big parties, so you'd have to kind of go with some of these guys were like that, where they wanted a lot of social engagement. And Rauschenberg was kind of like that. He liked a lot of attention.
What about David Hockney?
Hockney would come in also, and he used to have parties up at the suite, the Chateau Montmartre, and he was, he was part of the gay movement that was just exploding in London, and he had an entire network of powerful, influential gay activists in Los Angeles who also owned galleries. So when Hockney would come in, he worked very hard. He would come in with like the director of the Museum of Modern Art, Henry Geltzeller. He would come in with these very influential people, and he would immediately start doing his projects. And he was always fun to be around. He would drink, but he worked. He was a very hard worker, very good discipline, good work ethic. And then he would love to have parties.
What was your function when he came in?
Oh, I would. He pretty much was self-starter. I would just maybe suggest him. I'd just suggest paper. I might suggest that one of his drawings. He was doing a bunch of portraits at the time of important people in the art scene in Los Angeles, and sometimes I'd say, this is kind of a weak portrait. I don't know if you want to publish this one. Why don't you just kind of put this one aside and, mostly suggest paper or the size of the suite, and then again go through the pulls and say this edition looks like it's more like 40, even though you pulled 70. I would say 20 of them are not worthy of the edition, so kind of traditional curating, which is more what that is.
And which collaboration that you did would you say was the most creative or influential for yourself? Or
Well, I like Jasper because I was one of the things that attracted me to Gemini was all of the artists, of course, but I was obsessed with Duchamp as an art student. So who isn't, I suppose? So I was obsessed with Marcel Duchamp, and Jasper Johns was the clear legacy of Duchamp. Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg both spent a lot of time with Duchamp, but it was Johns who was really closest to the secrets that Duchamp seemed to be about. Anybody who knows anything about Duchamp knows that he spoke very little about what was the content of his work, and so which excited interest, and people read into Duchamp that he had all kinds of metaphysical secrets as well as artistic secrets and concepts, and so Johns was the legacy of Duchamp. And so I would do things. Me and there was another young artist who was now very successful, Ed Henderson. Ed and I were very close. So when Johns would leave after working, we would go into the studio and find his journal, which is a daily journal, and we would, it was naughty of us, but we would go through it to see if where are the secrets, the Duchamp secrets that must be in the journal. So we would do things like. He was trying not to drink. He was a very disciplined guy, but he was a drunk, and all these guys really were, and except for Lichtenstein, a very clean living guy. But most of these guys drank a lot, and Jasper was trying not to drink, and so we would do things with, Ed and I were the ones that Jasper liked the most, and so sometimes we'd work late into the night, and everybody would go home. It would just be Jasper, Ed, and myself. And we'd give Jasper booze. He kind of resisted, but he was an alcoholic. And so we were a couple of assholes who wanted to know the secrets of modern art. We're fresh out of graduate school. So we'd bring Jasper here, we're going to have a glass of bourbon. You want a glass of bourbon? So eventually he'd drink, and then we'd get Jasper a little bit plowed and try to find out, what's going on with Duchamp, and did he ever tell you about the glass and what, with the great glass? And we would try to dig into what he must have known about Duchamp. And when Jasper would do his prints, he would also do little paintings on the side where he would embody things like the Mona Lisa, because Jasper, anybody knows anything about Duchamp, when Duchamp objected to going to the war, World War I, the French government said you can be a conscientious objector, but you have to work in government. So Duchamp worked in the archives in Paris, and while he worked in the archives, he dug into the manuscripts of Leonardo da Vinci and The Alchemist during the medieval times, and so it was well known that Duchamp had some sort of metaphysical insight that he didn't share with anybody, that he got from reading manuscripts in the Parisian library that he had access to, and that's part of what's encoded in some of Duchamp's work. So we were convinced that Jasper had some of these secrets, and so Da Vinci was a very important person in Duchamp's life for that reason, and we always saw references that Johns made to Da Vinci. So when we would see Jasper working for a painting for himself while he was doing the series, we'd see him doing things like embedding underneath paint, so only he knew it was there, certain drawings and little pieces of Da Vinci's work would be collaged onto this painting, and then he would paint over it, and only we knew that it was in fact under the paint. you know. So he was doing all these very secretive things, and so that was very exciting to us two, you know, assholes just out of graduate school. All to what is this about? And is this one of the secrets that Jasper had, that Duchamp was holding? So that was a big deal for us. And so when we get Jasper would go home, Ed and I would go into the studio and look through all his notes and his notebooks, and we'd see pieces of Da Vinci in there, you know, and references to Da Vinci, and we never found anything. But we were convinced that, as I was convinced that Jasper had Duchampian secrets that came from medieval alchemists and Da Vinci. So it was very exciting.
And what about Liechtenstein? You mentioned Liechtenstein.
Liechtenstein was a gentleman. He was just a very, if you met him on the street, you'd think he was you know, owned a hardware store or something. You know, he was just a very organized, very polite gentleman. He was one of the few who didn't drink. He worked very hard, and he used to always laugh about people asking him to teach. He talked about that. He said, "I'm always asked." He said, "I don't know what I would teach. I don't have anything to teach." And so, you know, the guy that liked me a lot was Richard Serra, a very important sculptor who you met, honey. He seemed to glom on to me, and I used to hang out with Richard Serra a little bit. You know, you form relationships with these guys. So for a young artist, you know, hopeful, this was exciting. I was around and had personal.
Did you work on projects with Liechtenstein?
But just a little bit. He just was by himself. He didn't really need anybody. You know, he would just come in and he would do.
But he printed.
Yeah, I'd work with him. But you know, he just knew what he was going to do. He'd come in and do it, then leave. You know, there was nothing exotic about his approach. You know, you know his work, and he was infatuated with the printing of dots. That you know, it was called halftone printing, and he expanded the dots, and so he would do things like moldings on medieval architecture in a dot format, and you know, he was nothing flamboyant or eccentric about Liechtenstein at all.
How many years were you there?
Klaus Oldenburg, you know, was also very hermetic. I was there for 5 years.
And why did you leave?
I was convinced that that the more I stayed, the more it would intimidate my own blossoming as an artist. And I thought, and I had already set a kind of limit on how long I was going to stay, because the longer you stay, it's quite intimidating to be around these artists, because you know, you're being young, trying to gain the confidence to find my own direction. After a while, you know, I used to always quote Andre Duran when Jasper asked me to come to New York with him, and the very famous quote from Duran when Matisse met Duran, who was a young hopeful, and he asked Duran to come work with him in his studio. And Andre Duran said, you know, very little grows under the shade of great trees. So I used to say that, you know, like I'm not going to go with Jasper because I'll never blossom. You know, I'll always be in the shade of this great tree. You know, so
Well, thank you, honey. Great interview.